Hi, everybody who is joining us, who was not live in the moment with us here. Today we are together, IST bringing folks together to talk about the UK Home Office's consultation on ransomware payments. We are going to talk through the three different proposals and then just have an open conversation with two incredibly smart people and then me as a kind of helper on the side. Before we dive into it and do introductions, let me just run through a quick overview of the three proposals. Proposal number one is a targeted ban on ransomware payments by all public sector bodies and regulated owners and operators of critical national infrastructure. Proposal two is a broader ransomware payment prevention regime that covers all potential payments originating from the UK. And proposal three is a mandatory ransomware reporting regime, potentially including threshold-based reporting for suspected incidents. To discuss these conversations today, we have an amazing panel. I'll let each person introduce themselves just for a minute. And then maybe after we've introduced ourselves, we can dive right in first with what we like about the proposals, what speaks to us about it. And maybe I should introduce myself first. Sorry. I'm new on the IST team. I'm Michael Klein. I am the Senior Director for Preparedness and Response. And I just joined the IST team having recently left the US government. I was at the US Department of Education, where I was leading cyber policy and all of our work in preventing ransomware in working with the White House, CISA, FBI, and others. And trying to shore up the defensibility and resilience of our K-12 education sector. And before that, I was a teacher and spent a lot of time in education. I will give lots of awkward wait time and pause time for people to talk. Let me toss it over to Jen for intros.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. I'm Jen Ellis. I am a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, which is convened and led by IST, as I'm sure people tuning into this are already aware. I guess I feel like I'm like one of those talking bobbleheads. I just blurt out stuff about ransomware now. But I will leave it there. I think that's the most relevant thing.
My name's Jamie MacColl. I'm a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, or RUSI. I'm in the cyber research group here. Um, Despite my best efforts, almost all my research over the last 4 years has focused on ransomware. It's sort of problem that won't go away. A lot of it in particular has looked at the UK government's
Why
policy.
haven't you single-handedly solved the problem, Jamie? I don't.
Seriously.
Yeah. Um, well, I'm not Vladimir Putin, I guess.
Okay.
Oh,
Fair
shots
point. We're
fired.
coming in hot. Coming in hot. Okay. Um, let's start with framing for the folks who are listening today. What are the things that we like about the potential proposals? Let's keep it kind of broad and positive, go from there, and then we'll pull into the pieces that we think are maybe more tricky.
Shall I jump in? You're on a roll, so I almost feel like I should just let you go because that was great. Um, firstly, I like that there are proposals. I super applaud the UK government for the fact that they are trying to do something on this. They've stayed focused on the issue. Not only do they have this proposal about what the UK itself might do, but they continue to be really active in the counter-ransomware initiative, and working with, other governments around the world, which I think is really sensible because I think we really do need an international response to this problem if we're going to make headway. So I think that is great that there is a proposal, that there is focus, that they are continuing to stay engaged. We've had a change of government and we're still engaged on this topic. So that's a positive. And I will also say that I couldn't agree more with Charlie's point about the fact that we just really have a lack of clear visibility of what's going on. We have this magical patchwork quilt of information. And actually, because it's so patchworky and the visibility is so rough, we don't even know we don't even know if it's a beautiful quilt or if it's just a stack of patches, right? Like we actually don't know. I'm sorry, I'm really milking that metaphor. But we don't know how much the data overlaps with itself. Because we're so reliant on actually vendors putting out information based on their market. And we don't know how much that overlaps. We don't know all the gaps that we're missing. We don't know, sort of, to mix my metaphors, how much of the iceberg we can see. And so I think Charlie's exactly right that we need to have a lot more clarity about that. So I support broadly, we'll get into the specifics, but broadly I support the idea that we need more reporting and transparency and visibility. Jamie?
There's not much to add to that. Yeah, I agree with agree with all those points. And I mean, one thing I would add as well is that I would commend the Home Office and Charlie in particular for the amount of engagement that they've done over the last 3 months, particularly with industry and civil society. And it's very easy to just propose something and then shut up shop. But I think Charlie has done a very good job of getting out there and doing that.
Yeah, and maybe one more thing that I would add. So I would definitely emphasize the point on visibility because I think that having been, an IT director in a school district and then having been in a federal policy position where I was in charge of ensuring the safety of those school districts and not knowing how to get that information and people down below not knowing how to share that information effectively, there's just an incredible lack of visibility, especially on the government side. And oftentimes there's, as you said, Jen, a fragmented picture even on the corporate side of those folks that actually know the infrastructure more and can see. And so I think getting greater visibility into that is a huge, huge plus. One other piece I really liked was the framing of this as one of many parts of a broader resilience strategy, right? Like this is not the way we're going to solve ransomware, right? This is not the way we're going to protect our critical infrastructure, right? Like this
Yeah,
is one of many pieces to the puzzle that we might see coming together.
I think you're right, but
Please.
so I think you're right, and I completely agree, and I think it's smart that Charlie pointed that out. The but here is like we know the UK government is going to be working on broader pieces around resilience. We know this because it was reflected in the King's speech. And we saw something that said cybersecurity and resilience bill will come this year. We haven't really, I mean, we've got the proposal here for the ransomware consultation, but we haven't had a consultation for the CSRB. We don't know details of what will be in it. We know it's the update to the Network and Information Systems Directive, which the UK passed when it was a member of the EU. I love those days. And and so we know that the EU has updated the thanks, Charlie. Just in case people are not aware, Charlie has posted a link to the ransomware consultation in the chat. And this also gives me an opportunity to say to others, if you're on the chat, please feel free to post questions to us or comments about things that you're noticing in this. We definitely want to hear from you. I'm sorry, Michael, I'm just jumping in there and putting that plug out. But yeah, so back to CSRB, we haven't seen that same level of detail to know what the broader picture looks like. And because like we talked about incident reporting, right? All three of us like the idea of the incident reporting. Should it be specific to ransomware? I I don't know because mandating reporting generally is tricky, but also it does feel like it should be about cyber incidents more broadly, maybe narrowly to some subset, like maybe we do it like the Australians did and we make it about CNI reporting, but
Yep.
it does feel like it shouldn't just be ransomware to me.
Yeah, let me add on that. Yep, sorry.
No, so just I was just going to say, so yes, I agree with you that it's great that they're thinking about resilience more broadly. I would love to know what that actually looks like in detail and how the pieces all go together. And I think actually the reason this particularly matters is it's quite hard for people to give really nuanced answers to the consultation without having that information about what the other pieces look like. And I suspect what will happen is that the Home Office team, are going to end up receiving feedback that is really more about people's questions on CSRB than it is about the ransomware stuff.
Yeah, I would just add one thing there and would love to get your take on this, Jamie. But I think from my perspective, having lived through the CIRCIA conversation, and for those of us not in the United States, that would be the Critical Infrastructure Reporting for Cyber Incidents Act, I believe, which
Yep.
which the
Well,
U.S. which the U.S. was running through CISA, and the conversation there was exactly this conversation, Jen, right? Like who is covered? So, okay, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the U.S. It may be different in the U.K.
yeah.
Who counts? What are the thresholds? How do we determine what becomes overly burdensome? What counts as a covered incident? And in that case, it wasn't just ransomware, it was cyber incidents broadly, right? Which I think is a really good approach because then you get a much broader vision of what's happening. And the second component of that one was, and if you're going to make a payment, you have to tell us, right? And so that does get into the next piece of the puzzle about like, we want both and, right? We would like information about incidents broadly and specifically about ransomware payments, just so there's a better piece of that. And so that's like the US example. So I'll toss it to you, Jamie, from there.
Yeah, I think two reactions. I mean, on I guess just mandating reporting for ransomware specifically, there's also the question of, well, what is ransomware and how do you define that? And
Do
if
you
you
mean
ask,
extortion attacks
I'm sure,
or
yeah, the three of us may come up with quite different
Yep.
definitions for what it is. And is it just the malware or is it ransomware as a broad kind of type of cyber extortion?
Yep.
Um, and there's the kind of risk that whatever you end up with, threat actors just end up doing types of extortion that don't fit within that narrow definition. Um, or you define it so broadly that it ends up including things like sextortion against individuals, which we definitely don't want to be forcing victims to have to report for a number of reasons.
and
And then,
has there not been an indication? I thought the government had said that sextortion was the one thing that was definitely out of bounds.
yeah, but if you end up defining it as cyber extortion,
Then it sweeps it up.
then
Okay, got it. Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I think, and if people are submitting evidence to the consultation, I think that would it's something to think about. Like how would you define it? And then
Right.
on the broader connection to cyber resilience, I mean, in a way, my concern is less how does it connect to the cybersecurity and resilience bill, which is mostly about the security and resilience of critical national infrastructure in the UK, and more what provisions are going to be made for small and medium-sized businesses in the UK that may be told they can't pay a ransom now, or may be told that they're going to have to go through quite expensive reporting requirements that involve using a lawyer, for instance. Um, and it does feel quite, at the moment, the proposals feel quite siloed in terms of is there going to be an additional support for those types of victims?
Yeah. Do either of you have strong feelings, Jen or Jamie, about the different types of ransomware? So if we're talking about just disruptive ransomware, right? If we're talking about that kind of activity versus pure data extortion, which is where some of the ransomware activity has been moving more recently, do you see a distinction there in terms of this kind of a proposal?
I think it has to include both, and I think maybe the way to limit it is to limit it to organizations rather than individuals. So if you're like an end user whose like desktop gets ransomware, then you're not in scope. But if you are registered as a business, then you are.
I think that's smart. I agree with that completely. And I think if you focus the legislation on one group of activity, you push the attackers to the other, right? It'd be really easy to say, hey, you know what, we should ban payments for uh like data extortion, because realistically you can't you're not stopping them from having access to the data and to doing other things to monetize the data, but then all you're doing is pushing attackers back towards disruptive attacks, right? So I don't know that like deciding one or the other makes sense. I think it's much more, as Jamie said, about who's impacted. um the other thing I'll say is you brought up Sasia. I think the other question around reporting has to be around harmonization, or reciprocity, or whatever word you want to use to kind of get at this idea of lots of governments are looking at this problem. How do we make sure that we're not having a million different standards for this? And I know that the CRI has come up with some templates for reporting. Um, so I hope that headway will be made on that, and the CRI members will look to adopt something that is either pretty aligned or that can be somewhat blah 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 relevant to multiple nations, I guess. um And then the other thing is, I'm just watching the comments, and Deborah made a comment here where she asked a question about whether the requirements are likely to apply to organizations doing business in the UK that are not based here. I don't know that that is specifically called out. I think it's a really good question. And I think it's absolutely a question that should be asked by people who are responding to the consultation. And frankly, if that's the only thing you care about, that's fine. Just respond to the consultation and ask that question. You don't have to fill everything else in. I'm speaking on Charlie's behalf right now, which I definitely should not do. I'm not authorized to do it. But I think like they want to get the things that people care about that they're worried about. And frankly, it's less reading for them if you don't fill everything else in. So I think it's a really good question and definitely one that should be asked, but I don't know that there's an answer yet
I
available.
mean, I think if it doesn't apply to companies that have a presence in the UK, like an office in the UK or provide services in the UK, it's not going to have much teeth because most critical national infrastructure in the UK is privately owned, a lot of it by companies that are not headquartered in the UK.
Right.
So it's pretty easy to foresee a scenario in which those types of companies just make a payment in a different jurisdiction.
Right.
Yeah,
And
and Jamie,
I think,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
I was going to say, and to build on that and transition to Jeff's question about third-party risk, how do you all see the place where third-party risk fits into this? Like from my perspective, again, coming back to my time in education, in the US, and I'll use our context just for context, we have 14,000 school districts, all of their own IT infrastructure, and the vast majority of them have very, very few students and maybe one person, right? And so no one's rolling their own system for almost anything they use. It's all CSPs and kind of education-specific SaaS platforms, right? And so the vast majority of risk is actually in the cloud providers and in those managed services, not in the actual owner and operator of the infrastructure itself. And so how like this take into account the challenge of those really small, medium businesses or local governments who are really reliant on all of these other kind of upstream providers for the things that are ultimately going to get locked?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think that this comes back a little bit to what else is being done in resilience
Yep.
and what's going to be covered by CSRB. When the EU updated NIS, one of the things that they sort of acknowledged is that level of complexity and interreliance, right? And so they expanded out their definition of essential providers and included now infrastructure providers that underpin those essential services, right? And the UK government had a period of time where it was looking very much at the role of what they term digital service providers, which sort of runs the gambit of everything under that bucket, right? And I think so the question will be when we see language for the CSRB, what will that entail around the role of like where are we drawing a line? The other thing is you mentioned at the beginning, Michael, you said, hey, like we have 16 buckets of critical national infrastructure in the US. What does it look like in the UK? Well, it's a really good question because we don't have an official answer to that question. There is no official definition as I understand it. And I think one of the things that we're going to be looking at here is getting feedback on who should be covered and what the expectation should be on them. So, I do think there's an element here where people can provide feedback on what should be covered and whether, to Jeff's language, the soft underbelly of cybersecurity should be covered. But I think it's important to remember the ransomware consultation, the ransomware proposals are very specifically on ransomware incidents. And don't we want to have broader application of resilience around suppliers than just ransomware scenarios? So I would say, as it comes, I think it comes down to what the impact of a supplier getting hit by a ransomware attack is on the core entities, right? The reporting requirement, as we understand it, is likely to apply to everybody. And if there's a cutoff, it'll probably be based on size of organization rather than role of organization, right? The the ransom payments ban will go back to that piece around what is critical national infrastructure or what is a public sector supplier, and that will be the question that needs to be answered. So again, this is where I know I sound like a bad record, but this is where like people providing input to the UK government on who they think should or should not be in scope is really, really helpful.
And I can say from a US perspective, having been on the other end of many of these processes where we get this kind of feedback, like it's tremendously helpful because as you're trying to delineate, like, okay, is it district with 2,000 students or 5,000 students or 10,000 students? Like, what is the threshold that makes sense for even within what you've defined as critical national infrastructure, scoping where the cutoff is, right? Like, those things are tremendously important for the end users in this context, and people with that understanding are hugely important. Jamie, did you have anything else you wanted to add there? I can toss in some new questions.
No, nothing to that. I mean, I think to be honest, with these proposals, the only aspect of it that may affect third-party suppliers is whether the proposal around designating CNI follows a similar path to the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which depending on who you ask, may allow government or regulators to designate suppliers as critical national infrastructure, whether they are like, irregardless of whether they are technically within that sector. And that we could see a similar situation for the payment ban as well.
Awesome. So let's just get into the bomb throwing. Let's look at proposal 3 directly. Mandatory requirement reporting regime, potentially including, or no, sorry, not 3, I meant 1. Targeted ban on ransomware payments for all public sector and critical national infrastructure, or 2, broader ransomware payment regime. Like, let's think of this as a, Jamie, I've heard you've suggested the idea of, comparing 3 proposals before with like, which one would you like to kiss, which one would you marry, and which one would you like to avoid? So if that were the framing of this one, how might you approach this set of proposals?
I think
Yeah, what would you say?
the British model is snog, marry, kill, which
sounds so much classier when you say snog, marry, kill.
I think you already have an answer to this, Jen. So could I think about which ones
Yeah, no, I am happy to answer this. So I would snog proposal 1 because I think on its face, the idea of a ban on paying for critical infrastructure is very seductive. It looks very appealing. We think, oh yeah, that's hot. And actually, the reality is, I think it's really unlikely to do much for me in the long term. And I actually see Adam has posted a comment on this in the chat, and he's quoted somebody. I was like, that sounds a lot like me, except you've used the word expert, so probably not me. But yeah, I don't think long-term proposal 1 is likely to have a huge level of impact, because I think it suggests a degree of targeting that I'm not sure is really truly that valid. And it doesn't do enough to like drive attackers into other models, right? The quotes from Jamie. Damn it. Um, okay, then the word expert is warranted. Um, uh, I would marry reporting because I think in the long term, reporting is what's going to offer me the greatest satisfaction in life. I don't know, whatever it is, happiness, well-being. But I would avoid kill with fire, whatever the word is that you want to use. The payment prevention scheme, which I'm not a giant fan of. I don't. And I apologize, Charlie. I love you dearly. I just don't like this. My challenge with it is I don't understand the purpose of it. It feels like a ban by another name to me. I mean, really, the name isn't even that subtle, like payment prevention scheme. That sounds a bit like we wanted a ban, but we didn't think we could get one to pass, so we went another route, but we're really trying to get a ban. I think the idea that the government is going to check over your paperwork to make sure that you're not breaking sanctions is kind of nuts. Like, isn't that what your lawyers are for? Why is the government spending money on doing that? So that seems strange. And I also think that there's a concept here of time that doesn't make sense, right? Like any organization that's been hit by ransomware tells you that really they want to resolve the situation as soon as possible. In fact, the biggest driver for people to pay the ransom is to make things go away as quickly as possible, right? Government doesn't move that quick. Let's say that the government was able to like really move heaven and earth to make this happen, and they came up with an SLA of 3 days, which in government terms is super fast. In ransomware terms, that is a lifetime. And so I think that marrying those 2 levels of expectation is going to be really, really, really hard. And I think if the idea of this is like there's that campaign around before you click on a link, wait 30 seconds or take a breath or count to 10 or whatever it is. I think if the idea is like that, is like to make people think twice before paying, then I get the appeal, but I just don't know that I think this is the right way to go about it. And it feels like um it's adding a lot of bureaucracy and burden on victims at a time when they can't really afford it. So there you go. Strong Mary Kill.
Thank you, Jen. Jamie, jump right in.
Yeah, similarly, marry the reporting. I would kill the payment ban, and I'd probably snog the payment authorization regime, um, but reluctantly. Yeah, I mean, for similar reasons to Jen on the reporting, I think it's sort of the bare minimum that the government should be doing, and personally, I would probably fold mandatory reporting of payments into that as well, which I also think would probably be an alternative to the payment authorization regime, because if you want to inject friction into victim decision making, I think forcing them to report to a law enforcement or government entity might be enough to do that. And I think it's interesting that that's the path that Australia has gone down and just legislated. Um, and I would also be interested to learn from their experience with that and whether they believe that it has led to any reduction in payments or not. Um, on the having said that, sort of on snogging the payment authorization regime, I do ultimately think I would spend that money doing other things on ransomware. And I think the sort of the annual cost they've estimated is 17 million pounds, which doesn't seem like a lot, particularly for a US audience. But when you think about the level of resources that, say, cybercrime focused law enforcement has in the UK, that's actually quite a significant amount of money. That's probably 40 or 50 dedicated officers in the National Crime Agency that could be working on cybercrime and doing more of the kind of operations they've done over the last couple of years, like the takedown of Lockbit. Um, and if it's a choice in that way, that's how I would spend that money. On the
Awesome.
payment ban, as someone in the chat has quoted at me from an interview, um, I, I don't think that public sector victims should be paying. I don't think taxpayer money should be used to pay criminals. I think we can probably all agree on that.
Yep.
But I don't think that banning payments is for named sectors in the UK is gonna deterred attacks, because that is not how the operating model of ransomware threat actors works. It is, as the National Crime Agency and National Cybersecurity Centre's own white paper on ransomware says, it is a crime of opportunity and vulnerability. They're
Yep.
not going out, for the most, with obviously a few exceptions to this, they're not going out to target specific victims in specific countries or sectors. So I think to assume that this is somehow gonna like change that operating model, I think is a bit misguided. Um, and also, apart from anything, look, like the UK is a bit of a drop of in the ocean in global ransomware victims anyway, and UK CNI even more so. We're probably talking about, I don't know, 100 a year, maybe slightly more than that. I don't think
Yeah.
that's enough to change the calculus of the criminals.
Yeah.
Like,
Just wanted to add in a couple thoughts. Or Jen, did you want to build on that? If you did, I can wait.
yeah, I just wanted to sort of like two finger on which sounded really weird on what Jamie was saying. If you think about during the pandemic, right? There were a bunch of ransomware actors that said we're not going to go after healthcare. There were a bunch that were like we're not going to intentionally go after them, but if we hit them, we don't really care. And then there were a bunch who were like game on. And which one is really helpful because it highlights the fact that they're not a homogenous blob, right? They are different, and they operate differently, and they have different motivations and different levels of risk, acceptance, and tolerance, and also different levels of morality, right, or things that they care about, and so we should bear that in mind when we're trying to predict how they'll behave. But one of the things that happened, as we know, is that the Irish Health Executive got hit, right? HSE got hit, and the group behind it went, "Oopsie, we didn't mean to do that." And the reason that I bring this up is like that oopsie is not the only oopsie we've heard. We've heard multiple oopsies across the years, and it just goes to show that, like, really, when you're throwing malware at the internet, your ability to control where it goes is somewhat limited, right? There are other examples of this that we have that are quite famous, and I don't need to touch on because some of them involve government activity. But like, I think the reality is like the internet is a little bit interconnected. I think we can all agree. And so you can't always, I was talking to somebody the other day who's a victim of a ransomware attack, and they were under the impression that it was targeted and they're an entity that can't pay. And so they were a little
Yep.
bit bewildered about the whole thing. And I was like, yeah, it's targeted like I took a grenade and I threw it into the ocean. I chose to throw it that way rather than that way. But like it's not more targeted than that, right? Apart from, as Jamie said, on a few cases.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to know about the payment ban is like there are two main reasons that get cited, right? And again, I agree with Jamie that public sector, like public money shouldn't be used. That's a morality issue rather than it being about the pragmatics of how you stop ransomware, right? So the two pragmatic reasons that people cite are one, it will, if you take away the revenue stream of something that is profit driven, then people will stop doing it. So let's look at that, right? One, will they really stop doing it? Are we taking away their revenue stream? As Jamie said, we're taking a really narrow piece of the revenue stream away. So they're not going to stop doing it. We would need there to be a global ban on all ransom payments to take away their revenue stream. Even then, attackers wouldn't just be like, I'll go get myself a regular job then. They would instead probably test the metal, the resolve of those, and look for the weakest points, right?
Yeah.
So,
Or go to business email compromise or do some other thing that would get them the
right,
money they need. Yeah.
right. Before they move to finding what that new thing is, they're probably going to just be like, well, let's see. Let's see if small business owners are more likely to pay under the table, right? Or let's see if this hospital can close its doors for 3 weeks, right? They're probably more likely to like try pummeling the most vulnerable and exposed. So that's one. The other reason that people stay is if you have no potential to pay, you will invest more in resilience. It totally misses the point of why people don't invest in resilience today. And it does nothing to address that problem. And I think actually the reason I wanted to pull this point up is as I look at the proposals, my challenge is the proposals all focus on right of boom. Nothing in there focus, and I get, I led the prepare work stream. Focusing on left of boom is really hard. Coming up with really good suggestions that haven't been tried already is really, really hard. But thinking that you can tell people they can't pay a ransom and then all of a sudden they're going to be like, well, then I should go and hire myself a 10-person security team and buy all the products I need and I'll be good to go. Like it completely misses the point of what's actually happening in security today, or not happening, as the case may be. And it misses all the factors that impact organizations that sit below the security poverty line. And we don't have any response to how to help those organizations invest. There is nothing here about how we build more resilience. And I think it's funny because we started off by saying like that's a goal. We want to get to more resilience, but actually none of the proposals really focus on that one piece. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think on that point, I mean, the average small and medium-sized business in the UK is only going to learn that they can't pay a ransom or they have to ask for permission after
Yeah.
their ransomware.
Yeah.
That's because even just like pushing this out as guidance or awareness to the UK economy is going to be, and that's not necessarily a reason not to do it, but it is going to be challenging and expensive.
Yep. A couple quick things to note here, because Jen, you brought up the Ransomware Task Force and some prepare work, and so I think it's probably worth putting on my specific IST hat, even though I have the background image and all that kind of stuff, and say like on the proposal that's specifically about payments or is specifically about mandatory reporting. So in the Ransomware Task Force report, objective 4.2 was increase the quality and volume of information about ransomware incidents. This is something we're all seemingly on board with. Like, we should know more about this. We need to know what the kind of like denominator looks like in terms of all the number of incidents that we're dealing with here. and requiring organizations to do that reporting with the national government is super helpful. I think there's a question of whether that's prior to payment, whether that's after payment, because that gets in the way of actually resolving the issue. And that's an important thing for people to weigh in as they're kind of weighing into this particular consultation, if you have strong feelings about one versus the other. For proposal 2, which was the kind of complete ban, or like consultation process before you pay situation. I think figuring out ways to require organizations to consider alternatives in the process is super helpful. I think it's hard, Jen, because a lot of that is that prepare work. Like you need to be having those discussions in a tabletop activity or with your cyber insurer or sometime in the process prior to the incident occurring for you to meaningfully be able to make that choice. Right? Because like if you're going into this cold, you're a flower shop in London or wherever, get hit, you don't have the capacity to think that through in the moment. And so kind of figuring that piece out is going to be really important as well. And then I think the other piece that I've heard people say in talking about ransomware payments and should we do a total ban, I think you're describing, Jen, like a collective action problem, right? Like we can't solve this problem in England. We need to solve this problem internationally. And so what is the way to get there? And I think seeing kind of a ransomware payment ban as like the end state of some possible world could potentially make sense once you've done a lot of other things before then to like facilitate people to deal with the process as it's going to get there. And I don't know, the only other point I would make is that one of the big challenges I think people face is that like they don't necessarily understand all of the externalities that come from making the payment, right? Because they're not thinking about those. Like they're just thinking about like, I need my business to survive. And so figuring out ways to internalize that risk, I don't know when that happens or how that happens. Is another potential thing to think about there.
Yeah, I think there's the point around the UK doing this in isolation is an interesting one, and I do think the success of the payment ban in particular, whether partial or total, will ultimately, to some extent, depend on it being internationalized and other countries following suit. Because otherwise, I just don't think it seeps into the consciousness of the threat actors in a meaningful way. And I do wonder, and I can't put words in the government's mouth, the extent to which this was designed with a different US administration in mind. And, for instance, a deputy national security advisor that had been pushing for a ransomware payment ban. That is speculation, but I don't know if Jen has a view on that.
No, I mean, I think it's a reasonable. I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of that question, but I think it's a completely reasonable thought process. And certainly the UK is not the only country that has been like advocating for a ransomware ban. And I think there are discussions about it across the CRI, and it'd be interesting to see what happens from that point of view. Um, I think, just looking at some of the comments in the thread. So Adam, I think maybe his comments are not visible to everybody, just to us. But one of the things he asked, which relates to this question of the partial ban, is he basically said, are you not restricting one of the means by which a victim can get back up and running? What if that victim is providing essential services to the UK economy and vulnerable customers? And this is the thing. So the co-chairs, the RTF co-chairs, we like all got together in the original RTF report or set of recommendations. We didn't make a recommendation about a payment ban because there was at the time so much like broad disagreement and questioning about really what the outcomes would be. And it actually was funny because quite a lot of people who participated in the conversation started in one position and ended in the other. I started being really pro-ban, and then I ended being quite anti-ban. And actually, the reality is I'm not truly anti-ban. I believe that if you want to get to a ban, you have to create a path to get there, and you have to think about how you provide support for those who are the most vulnerable, who are the most easy to exploit in this situation. And when I say exploit, I don't mean hit up with ransomware. I mean, take advantage of their position, right? And this goes to Adam's question, because I think if you were to say we want to have a ban, but we're going to provide a mechanism for organizations to say if they get hit, they can come to the government and they can get both operational support on recovery and financial support at favorable repayment terms for recovery. And that's if they choose recovery rather than payment, right? Then I think you could actually like make a case that you're doing that piece to try and get people along that path of building resilience for themselves and looking at how money is spent and how it's supporting the sort of criminal networks, right? But I think without having that piece, exactly to Adam's point, without having that piece to provide additional support, really we're not doing enough to change the needle of where companies are today, what their actual resilience and security posture looks like. We're just taking away an option for them of how to get themselves out of the situation when it occurs. So yeah, Adam, good point.
That's just, I mean, that is kind of like a national insurance pool, basically what you're suggesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know that right now this is like probably I shouldn't be adding things that the government should spend money on. But that's not a popular conversation today. We've got a budget check-in today, so it's not a good day to bring it up. Um, but I think but we do have to be thinking about what does building that resilience piece and providing that level of support look like, rather than effectively punishing people for being victims of something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
I guess my cynicism or skepticism is I just I don't believe the UK government is going to like radically change how it provisions
Oh,
like
I agree.
primary
It's not.
support.
I'm not suggesting it's actually going to happen. But that doesn't change the fact that if you want to have a ban, then in my view, you have to think about what you do to support people who, like, maybe not everybody, but certainly like there should be some level of consideration, particularly as the UK economy is a 99% SME economy, right? The vast majority of organizations in the UK sit below the cyber poverty line. They have no ability to invest. And bear in mind that cybersecurity is not a one and done investment. We love in the security industry to talk about this as if, like, on a Monday morning, you're going to implement offline backups. And then on a Tuesday morning, you can implement identity and access management. Hey, on Wednesday, let's get to patching. And like the reality is like that's not how these things work. We're talking about large scale time and resource investments in perpetuity, which we're not even being able to say to people, hey, do it for 2 years and then you can reallocate that budget. No, you have to continue. You probably have to increase it over time. Like this is not an easy sell, right? And companies aren't not doing this because they're lazy or they're not interested. They're not doing it because they can't afford it, right? They actually just can't get there. And so for us to like make it seem simple is it just feels like victim shaming to me. It feels a little bit like saying, well, you were wearing a short skirt. And I just don't like that very much.
okay, Jen.
I know that was a bit of a more
No, I think that is amazing. That passion is what makes you amazing at what you do. Pulling back for a second. So if I can summarize what I think you were saying, hopefully accurately. If one were to want to do this as the end goal, there are all of these enabling things that need to happen prior to that in order for that to be successful. And then there's a question about like, could this even be successful in the best of all possible worlds, right? So that's an important piece to consider. Proposal and for the consultation, I think having been people who've engaged in these consultations before, like how can people on the call or watching this afterward add the most value in contributing to this, even if they haven't necessarily done that before? Like where can we really provide whatever your perspective is in the most helpful way?
Yeah.
um I think that yeah, so just very quickly, sorry, Adam asked the question of um, have the UK, I mean, and Jamie addressed this at the beginning. The Home Office have been really good at approaching people, talking to people, trying to get input. The reality is, like, Jamie and I are just two people. We don't represent everybody. We don't necessarily have the same views as everybody. We have been very buried in this topic, and we have strong points of view as a result. There's also the realities of what governments can and can't do. I mean, as Jamie and I just said, the reality is they're probably not going to create a new fund. There are an awful lot of demands on budget, and apparently we have to increase defense budgets, which we know we do. So, like, I think it's very realistic that that this is what they focused on, and I just want to be really clear that the Home Office has been really, really listening to people, which actually leads me back to Michael's question because I think they really do want to hear from you. And as I said before, pick the bits you care about, right? If you go into the consultation, I think there's a thing where you can look at all the questions. There's also, even if you don't want to take questions, normally there's a way of like actually just sending an email to them and being like, hey, I didn't take the survey, but here's the thing that I really care about. It won't go into their quantitative data analysis, but it will get read and it will get, it will get considered. So pick the things that you care about. You don't have to respond to everything. And it's also okay if you don't have answers. You can ask questions to make sure that the people that should be asking those questions and thinking about those things are doing so. Where you can, if you have ideas on solutions, by all means propose them. That's really helpful. And if you have anecdotal evidence or other types of evidence, data, etc., please share it. That's really helpful for them. But it is like it's one of those things of number one, anybody has the right to respond. We live in a democratic nation, anybody has a voice. And you don't have to be in the UK, number two. So if you care about this topic wherever you are, it's totally worth paying attention and participating. Number three, pick what you care about and focus on that. And then I would just say, like, make it as simple and straightforward as you can. And probably like focus on the stuff that matters the most so that they're not reading loads and loads and loads. Although Charlie might disagree. And Charlie has provided an email address specifically for people to be able to send things beyond the survey, which is super kind of you. Thank you, Charlie. So there you go. That is Charlie basically opening the door as wide as possible for people to respond. I know that we're right at time and I have not shut up and given Jamie a chance, but I really feel like I'm going to get an email from Scott if I don't quickly address his question about the EU. I will just laugh and say I think it's super unlikely that the EU is likely to go. Sorry, this is Rick Scott. I think it's really unlikely that the EU will be like the UK's got a good idea. We should follow that. With more of an accent, obviously. But you never know because they are looking at this problem too, and they are a member of the CRI, and also specific EU members are very active in the CRI. So I think it's likely that there are various countries in the EU who will be looking at this, and they will be pushing topics up to EU discussion on their own behalf. I don't think it will necessarily be in response to what the UK is doing, though.
Thank you, Jen. Jamie, any last thoughts before we go?
Yeah, I mean, nothing to add to that really, other than yeah, get involved. I mean, I've spent 4 or 5 years complaining about the government not doing enough in ransomware. So at the very least, let's applaud them for doing something and tell them what we think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for giving us this opportunity to respond to all these ideas, and Jen and Jamie for your incredible expertise in talking us through how we might approach these things. I need to go and run and pick up my child because childcare in the United States is terrible, and I need to go
Thank
get
you
it.
for hosting us, Michael. Very much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful